In the quiet fishing town of Port Harbor, where the morning fog rolls thick across empty docks, the black-tide motorcycle gang just made the worst mistake of their lives. When they spotted the old man at the end of Pier 7, methodically arranging his fishing gear, they thought they'd found an easy target. Instead, they've just awakened a sleeping giant. James Connor isn't just some aging fisherman. He's a former SWAT tactical specialist with over 90 successful operations under his belt. Now, as his destroyed equipment drifts in the harbor waters, 2 decades of elite training are about to resurface. This is the story of how 30 arrogant bikers learned that sometimes the most dangerous predator isn't the one you see coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The salt-laden breeze carried whispers of dawn across Port Harbor as James Connor performed his morning ritual. Every day for the past 5 years, he'd arrive at Pier 7 just as the first hints of light painted the sky in watercolor hues. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision, arranging fishing gear that had become as familiar as the tactical equipment he once wielded. The wooden planks creaked beneath his boots, a sound that had replaced the echo of combat boots on concrete. Here, among the gentle lapping of waves and crying seagulls, he'd found something he never thought possible after 30 years of urban warfare. Peace. Black coffee, 2 sugars, came a familiar voice behind him. Sarah Chen, owner of the harbor. View Diner stood there with her usual warm smile and a steaming cup. Her arrival was as much a part of his morning routine as the sunrise itself. "You're early today, James." He accepted the coffee with a slight nod, his eyes never leaving the horizon. "Water's good today. Fish are running." His words were few, but Sarah had learned to read the volumes hidden in his silence. The memories came uninvited, as they often did in these quiet moments. His last mission, the one that changed everything, the hostage situation in downtown Seattle, had gone sideways. Fast. He could still hear the radio chatter, see the infrared signatures through his tactical gear, feel the weight of split-second decisions that meant life or death. "You're gone again," Sarah observed softly, leaning against the railing beside him. She never pushed, never pried. Maybe that's why he'd gradually allowed her to become part of his carefully structured world. "Just ghosts," he replied, taking a sip of coffee. "They're quieter here." A distant rumble interrupted the morning calm. Both turned to see a convoy of motorcycles rolling into town, their chrome gleaming in the early light. Black leather, studded jackets, and an air of menace that Connor recognized all too well. "Third group this week," Harbormaster Peterson called out as he approached, his face creased with worry. "Been hearing stories from Millbrook and Cedar Creek. These boys aren't just passing through. They're setting up shop, causing trouble." Connor watched the bikers disappear into the town, his trained eye noting their formation, their behavior patterns, the subtle signs of organization that went beyond typical gang structure. "How bad?" "Bad enough," Peterson sighed. "Extortion, vandalism, couple of beatings. Police there couldn't do much. Or wouldn't. Lot of folks saying they're paid off." Sarah's hand brushed Connor's arm, a gesture of concern he'd normally shy away from. But 5 years of morning coffees had earned her that right. "Maybe you should take a few days off, James, until they move on." Connor began methodically checking his fishing lines, his movements deliberate and precise. To untrained eyes, he was just a cautious fisherman preparing his gear. But Sarah had known him long enough to recognize when the SWAT officer was surfacing beneath the fisherman's calm exterior. "Weather's too good to waste," he said simply, but his eyes tracked the direction the bikers had taken, mentally mapping their route through town. "Besides, fish don't catch themselves." As Sarah headed back to her diner and Peterson continued his rounds, Connor settled into his usual spot at the end of the pier. His fishing rod was positioned perfectly, his tackle box arranged with military precision. To anyone passing by, he was just another retiree seeking solitude on the water, but his keen eyes didn't miss the second group of bikers that rolled in an hour later, or the way they systematically circled the town's main streets. He noted their numbers, their weapons poorly concealed under leather jackets, the hand signals they used to communicate. The peaceful morning waters were beginning to stir with darker currents, and James Connor felt a familiar tension building. In his muscles, the same tension that had preceded every major operation in his former life. Something was coming to Port Harbor, something that might force him to break the one promise he'd made to himself when he'd chosen this quiet life. No more violence. But as he watched another group of bikers roll past the pier, their engines deliberately revved to disturb the morning. Peace. He remembered another promise, one he'd made long ago when he first put on the SWAT badge, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The fish weren't biting that morning, but James Connor barely noticed. His mind was already running through scenarios, mapping out sightlines, identifying defensive positions, and cataloguing resources, all while appearing to do nothing more than adjust his fishing line. Some skills, he knew, you never really forgot, just like some promises you can never really escape. By midday, the Black Tide motorcycle gang had made their presence impossible to ignore. The peaceful rhythm of Port Harbor gave way to the thunderous roar of engines and the sharp bark of laughter that carried undertones of threat. From his vantage point on the pier, Connor watched as they began marking their territory like wolves in a new hunting ground. The Harborview Diner became their first target. Connor's jaw tightened as he watched 6 of them swagger through Sarah's front door, their boots tracking mud across her meticulously cleaned floors. Even from the pier, he could see her spine stiffen as she approached their table. Trouble. Police Chief Tom Barnes appeared beside Connor, his casual stance betraying years of law enforcement experience. Tom was one of the few who knew Connor's background. They'd crossed paths during joint operations years ago. "Not yet," Connor replied, reeling in his line with practiced ease. "But it's coming." Tom nodded, his weathered face grave. "They're led by Marcus Sharp, goes by Razor. FBI's got a file on him thicker than my arm, but nothing sticks. Protection rackets, drug trafficking, suspected murder, but witnesses have a funny way of disappearing." A commotion from the diner drew their attention. One of the bikers had grabbed Sarah's wrist as she served their food. Connor's muscles coiled instinctively, but he forced himself to remain still as Sarah deftly twisted free, her face a mask of professional politeness. "Your people ready?" Connor asked quietly. Tom's bitter laugh said everything. "Got 8 officers total. 2 are fresh from academy, 1's a month from retirement, against 30 hardcore gang members." He shook his head. "We're a small town. A force, James. Never needed more until now." The afternoon brought more signs of the gang's expanding control. They stationed men at strategic points throughout town: the gas station, the marketplace, the main intersection. Connor recognized their deployment pattern. It wasn't random. This was methodical, planned. Their leader finally made his appearance as the sun began to set. Marcus Razor Sharp lived up to his name, all sharp angles and cutting edges, from his blade-like cheekbones to the modified knife he toyed with constantly. He rode through town on a custom black Harley, the machine's deep growl announcing his presence like a predator's warning. Connor observed him from behind his fishing gear, noting the way Sharp's eyes scanned the environment, how he tracked movements and assessed threats. This wasn't just some thug who'd lucked into leadership. Sharp had training. "Your coffee's getting cold," Sarah's voice interrupted his thoughts. She'd walked out to the pier after closing early, another sign of changing times. They didn't. By the way, but they did mention they'll be providing protection services to local businesses starting tomorrow. "Protection from what?" Connor asked, though he already knew the answer. "From them," Sarah replied. her voice tight with anger. "Mr. Peterson already got a visit. They're asking for 30% of all dock fees. Said they'd hate to see any. Boats get damaged." Connor's hand tightened imperceptibly on his fishing rod. "Tom knows. He's doing what he can. Told them protection racketing is a federal offense." They just laughed. Sarah hugged herself against the evening chill. One of them said, and I quote, "Federal laws don't mean much when federal agents take 3 hours to respond." As if to emphasize her point, the roar of motorcycles echoed through town again. A group of Black Tide members were making another circuit, marking their territory. Local residents hurried to get off the streets. Shops closed early. Doors were locked. "They're not just passing through," Connor observed. "This is an occupation." Sarah touched his shoulder lightly. "James, I know that look. I've seen it before when you talk about your past. Whatever you're thinking, I'm thinking the mackerel aren't biting today," he interrupted gently. But his eyes were tracking the bikers' patrol pattern, noting their weapons, analyzing their formation. "You should head home, Sarah. It's getting dark." She lingered for a moment, clearly wanting to say more, but understanding that she wouldn't get through. Not when he had that distant look in his eyes. "Just be careful, James. These aren't fish you're dealing with." As she walked away, Connor began packing up his gear with military precision. Each movement was measured, each tool returned to its exact place. To anyone watching, he was just another fisherman calling it a day. They wouldn't notice how his practiced eye marked every defensive position along the pier, every potential choke point in the marina, every possible escape route. Through the boatyard, the last rays of sunlight glinted off chrome and leather as the Black Tide gang settled into their newly claimed territory. They thought they were the predators here, Connor mused as he shouldered his fishing gear. They had no idea they were, swimming in waters where something far more dangerous lurked beneath the surface. A message crackled over Sharp's radio as Connor walked past their staging area. "Boss, locals are falling in line. Except for that old fisherman at Pier 7. He's still out there, watching." Sharp's voice carried clearly in the evening air. "Then maybe it's time we taught him how dangerous it is to stare at the tide too long." Connor allowed himself a small, grim smile as he walked home. Some tides, he knew, were about to learn how dangerous it was to underestimate still waters. Dawn hadn't yet broken over Port Harbor when they came for him. The fog hung thick over the water, turning the world into a grey canvas of shadows and silence. James Connor was in his usual spot on Pier 7, setting up his gear with the same precision he'd once used to check his tactical equipment. The vintage tackle box beside him had been Mary's last gift before cancer took her. "Every retired man needs a hobby," she'd said, her smile bright even in her final days. The rod had been her father's, a piece of family history she'd wanted him to carry forward. Each piece of his fishing gear carried memories, anchoring him to this peaceful life he'd built from the ashes of his past. The rumble of motorcycles cut through the morning mist. Connor counted the engines by sound. 8 bikes, approaching in a staggered formation. Their headlights carved yellow tunnels through the fog as they rolled onto the pier, the wooden planks groaning under the weight of their machines. "Well, look what we've got here, boys," Razor Sharp's voice carried across the pier as he dismounted. "The watchdog of Pier 7. His boots struck the wood with deliberate force as he approached. "You know, old man, I couldn't help but notice how you've been keeping an eye on us." Connor continued arranging his lines, each movement calm and measured. His peripheral vision tracked the other riders as they spread out in a semicircle behind their leader. 3 carried concealed weapons in their jackets, 2 had brass knuckles, and 1 was trying to hide a length of chain behind his leg. "Fish don't catch themselves," Connor replied evenly, testing the tension in his line. Sharp kicked the tackle box, sending it skittering across the pier. Decades of instinct screamed at Connor to react, but he remained still, watching as Mary's last gift came to rest at the edge of the wooden planks. "You see, that's your first mistake," Sharp sneered, stepping closer, thinking this is about fishing. He drew his knife, a modified combat blade that had seen use. This is about respect, about understanding your place in the new order. The tackle box teetered on the edge of the pier as one of the gang members nudged it with his boot. Inside Connor's mind, a tactical assessment was already running. 8 hostiles, civilians likely present in nearby boats, multiple weapons but poor discipline in their handling, escape routes limited by pier layout. Last chance, old-timer. Sharp pressed the knife against Connor's cheek, drawing a thin line of blood. Show some respect, or we show you what happens to people who don't know their place. Connor met Sharp's gaze, and for just a moment, the gang leader saw something flicker in the old fisherman's eyes. Something that should have warned him. But arrogance had always been Sharp's weakness. Nothing to say? Sharp grinned, then nodded. To his men, show him. What followed was a symphony of destruction. They started with the tackle box, kicking it into the water with a splash that sent ripples across the still harbour. The rod, Mary's father's rod, was snapped in half, each piece thrown into the murky depths. Lines were cut, gear was scattered, and decades of memories sank beneath the dark waters. Connor stood motionless throughout it all, his face an impassive mask. But inside, something was shifting. Each splash, each crack, each laugh from the gang members was stripping away the layers of peace he'd built over the years, revealing the hardened tactical officer beneath. "Police! Break it up!" Officer Jenny Martinez's voice rang out from the shore end of the pier. She was one of Tom's rookies, brave but inexperienced, her hand nervous on her holstered weapon as she approached the scene alone. Sharp turned slowly, his smile becoming predatory. "Well, if it isn't Port Harbor's finest, little early for your patrol, isn't it, sweetheart? Step away from him," Martinez ordered, her voice steadier than her hands. "This is your only warning." The gang members spread out, their formation unconsciously professional, confirming Connor's suspicion about their training. Sharp moved toward Martinez with the casual confidence of a man who'd dealt with law enforcement before. "Or what?" he asked softly. "You'll call for backup, all 8 of your department's officers?" He gestured around at the empty pier. "Look around, honey. You are alone out here." "She's not alone." Connor's voice cut through the tension. The tone had changed. Gone was the quiet fisherman, replaced by something harder, colder. Last chance to walk away. Sharp turned back to Connor, genuine amusement in his eyes. "Or what, old man? You'll bore us with fishing stories?" He raised his knife. "Maybe it's time we taught both of you a lesson about—" The next 3 seconds were a blur of motion that would later have the gang members questioning their own memories. Connor's hand shot out, catching Sharp's knife arm at precisely the right pressure point. A twist, a step, and the gang leader's own momentum sent him stumbling forward. The knife clattered on the wooden planks, and before anyone could react, Connor had positioned himself between Martinez and the gang, his stance deceptively relaxed but perfectly balanced. "Jesus," one of the gang members whispered. "Did you see? Kill them both!" Sharp roared from his knees, his face red with rage and embarrassment. What followed was a brief but brutal demonstration of why SWAT officers were considered elite. Connor moved with an economy of motion that spoke of decades of experience, each strike precise and devastating. 2 gang members went down before they could draw their weapons. A third was disarmed and unconscious in the same fluid movement. Martinez had drawn her weapon, but Connor's positioning had given her a clear field of fire without making her a target, a tactical decision she wouldn't realize until much later. When it was over, 4 gang members were down, 3 were backing away, and Sharp was pulling himself to his feet, his eyes burning with hatred and something else. Recognition. "Stand down!" Martinez shouted, her confidence growing as backup sirens wailed in the distance. "This isn't over," Sharp spat blood onto the pier. "Not by a long shot." He gestured to his remaining men, and they retreated to their bikes, the roar of engines cutting through the morning peace. As they disappeared into the fog, Connor looked down at the empty pier where his fishing gear had been. Each ripple in, the water below carried away another piece of the peace he'd built, another memory of Mary, another chance at a quiet life. "Sir," Martinez approached cautiously, holstering her weapon. "Are you all right?" What was that?" Connor turned to her, and the young officer instinctively straightened under his gaze. "Get Tom on the radio," he said quietly. "Tell him it started. He'll understand." As Martinez called in her report, Connor stared out at the harbor waters, where Mary's last gift had disappeared. The peaceful fisherman had died with those ripples, and something else had risen to take his place, something that had been sleeping beneath the surface all along, waiting for a moment just like this. The basement of Connor's modest waterfront home held more than just fishing equipment and old furniture. Behind a false wall, concealed by years of carefully maintained misdirection, lay the remnants of his previous life. The hidden room had been Mary's idea. "Just in case," she'd said, understanding him better than he understood himself. His fingers moved across the keypad, hidden behind an old tackle box, muscle memory recalling the combination. The door slid, opened silently, revealing a space that smelled of gun oil and preserved leather. Everything was exactly as he'd left it 5 years ago, each piece of equipment maintained despite his retirement. Never again, he'd promised Mary on her deathbed. But as he lifted the false bottom of an old trunk, revealing his tactical gear, he could almost hear her voice. "Promises are meant to protect people, James. Sometimes keeping them does more harm than breaking them." The equipment was pristine. Tactical vest, combat boots, communications gear, and an array of non-lethal weapons that had been his trademark in SWAT. Connor had always preferred precision over power, control over chaos. He began laying out the gear with methodical care, each piece a reminder of skills that had never truly faded. His phone buzzed, a text from Sarah. "They're back, demanding protection money from everyone on Harbour Street." Connor moved to his workshop window, which offered a clear view of the main street. The Black Tide gang had evolved their tactics, working in smaller groups, more organized than typical thugs. Their deployment patterns suggested military or law enforcement background, likely dishonorably discharged, based on their lack of discipline. He pulled out a weathered notebook and began mapping the town, marking observation points, potential ambush locations and escape routes. Port Harbor's layout was both a blessing and a curse. Limited access points made it easier to control, but also easier to be trapped. A knock at his door interrupted his planning. Sarah stood there, her usual confident demeanor shaken. "They took everything from the register," she said without preamble. "Said it was their welcoming tax. Police came, took statements, did nothing. Jenny Martinez tried to intervene, but Chief Barnes held her back, said they didn't have enough evidence or manpower." Connor guided her inside, noting how her eyes widened at the tactical gear laid out on his table. "You're really doing this, aren't you?" she asked quietly. "They need to be stopped," he replied, turning back to his maps. "Before someone gets killed." Sarah picked up one of his surveillance photos, showing the gang's patrol routes. "I know these roads better than anyone. Done deliveries for the diner for 15 years. Their blind spots are here, here, and here." She pointed to different locations. "And the old cannery has underground access to half the waterfront." Connor looked at her sharply. She met his gaze without flinching. "I'm not asking permission, James. This is my home too." A ghost of a smile crossed his face as he pulled out another map. For the next hour, they worked together. Sarah's intimate knowledge of the town's hidden paths and daily rhythms adding layers to his tactical assessment. She knew which boats were always docked, which warehouses were empty, which alleys connected where. As dusk approached, Connor spotted 3 gang members through his window, systematically working their way through the neighborhood. Their pattern was predictable, a common mistake for those who thought their power made them invulnerable. "They're getting bolder," Sarah observed. "Razor's been bragging at the diner about making an example of anyone who resists." Connor checked his surveillance equipment. Motion sensors, small cameras, and electronic perimeter alerts, all still functional after 5 years. "Time to remind them they're not the only predators in these waters." Sarah touched his arm, her expression concerned but resolute. "Just don't lose yourself in this, James. We need you to stop them, yes, but we also need you to remain the man you are." He covered her hand with his for a moment, then turned back to his preparations. The time for fishing was over. Now it was time to hunt. As Sarah left, Connor began deploying his surveillance network throughout the town, each sensor placed with precise purpose, each camera positioned to create a web of observation. By midnight, he'd have eyes and ears on every major intersection, every gang gathering point. The tactical gear felt familiar as he put it on, like greeting an old friend he'd hoped never to see again. But as he watched another shop owner hand over cash to the gang through his newly placed cameras, he knew there was no going back. Port Harbor had given him peace when he needed it most. Now it was time to return the favor. The hunter was awake, and the tide was about to turn. Midnight cast long shadows across Port Harbor's waterfront as 2 black tide members made their rounds, their boots heavy on the wooden boardwalk. They were checking the protection payments from the day's collections, counting their take under. The dim glow of streetlights. 10 grand, the larger one grinned, thumbing through the cash. "Not bad for a day's work in this fish-bait town." His partner tensed suddenly. "You hear that?" A soft splash echoed from beneath the pier, followed by the gentle creak of wood. Natural harbor sounds, but something felt wrong. The darkness between the boats seemed deeper than usual. "Probably just rats," the first man said, but his hand moved to the weapon concealed under his jacket. The attack came without warning. A shadow detached itself from the darkness, moving with fluid precision. The first man's cry was cut short, as an arm locked around his throat in a perfectly executed chokehold. His partner reached for his gun, but something struck his wrist with surgical accuracy. A rubber training round, military grade. The weapon clattered away into the darkness. Connor moved like water, each action flowing seamlessly into the next. The larger man lost consciousness in exactly 12 seconds, not enough time to cause permanent damage, but enough to ensure he'd wake up with a message. The second man backed away, but Connor had positioned himself between the gang member and all potential escape routes. "The money!" Connor's voice was calm, controlled. "All of it!" "You're dead, old man," the gang member snarled, but fear had crept into his voice. "When Razor hears about this, he'll hear exactly what I want him to hear." Connor stepped forward, his movements measured. "The money now!" The gang member's nerve broke. He threw the bag of cash and ran, his footsteps thundering on the boardwalk. Connor let him go. A message delivered by a terrified messenger was worth more than any tactical advantage gained by stopping him. He retrieved the money and pulled out his phone, sending a quick text to Chief Barnes. "Protection money recovered. At Pier 4, 1 unconscious suspect. Evidence secured." Within 10 minutes, Jenny Martinez arrived, her patrol car lights off as requested. She found the money laid out next to the unconscious gang member, along with a bodycam recording showing him accepting payments from terrified shop owners. "Anonymous tip?" she asked with a knowing look, securing the evidence. Connor was already gone, melted back into the shadows of his harbor, but his message had been sent. The police now had evidence they couldn't ignore, and the Black Tide Gang had their first taste of what was to come. Back in his workshop, Connor reviewed the footage from his surveillance cameras. The gang's response was immediate and predictable. Increased patrols, tighter groups, nervous glances into shadows. Fear was spreading through their ranks, exactly as planned. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "They're at the diner." Razor's furious, asking questions about you. Connor's reply was brief. "Stay safe, watch for my signal." On his tactical map, he marked the first engagement point. One small victory, precisely executed. The gang would respond with increased aggression. Of course, they would try to reassert their dominance through violence and intimidation, but that would only make them more predictable, more vulnerable to his next move. As dawn approached, Connor heard the roar of motorcycles, more than usual. The gang was mobilizing, trying to show strength, but beneath their display of power, he could sense their uncertainty. The hunters were becoming the hunted, and they didn't even know where to look for their predator. Phase 1 was complete. Now it was time to prepare for their retaliation. The harbor view. Dinah's windows shattered inward as the first brick crashed through, followed quickly by two more. Sarah's morning customers screamed and ducked for cover as glass rained across their breakfast plates. Outside, the roar of motorcycles, mixed with mocking laughter. "That's just the beginning," one of the gang members shouted. "Tell your pet watchdog that next time it won't be just windows." Connor watched from the shadows of the old cannery across the street, his jaw tight. They'd chosen their target well. Hitting Sarah's diner was a direct challenge. They knew she was connected to him, had figured out she was someone he cared about. His tactical instincts screamed at him to move, to engage, to neutralize the threat. But that's exactly what they wanted. This was bait, designed to draw him out. Through his surveillance equipment, he could see 3 more gang members positioned on nearby rooftops, waiting with clear lines of sight. "James," Sarah's voice crackled through his earpiece. He'd given her a concealed communicator the day before. "I'm okay, but Mrs. Peterson is hurt." Flying glass caught her arm. Connor's fingers tightened on his tactical gear. Mrs. Peterson was 73, a widow who came in every morning for coffee and toast. How bad? Superficial, but she's scared. Everyone is. They're just sitting out there, waiting. He studied the gang's deployment. Their strategy showed military thinking, multiple elevated positions, overlapping fields of fire, deliberately provocative ground team to draw out their target. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd assumed he would be coming from street level. "Get everyone into the kitchen," Connor instructed. "Use the walk-in freezer as cover if needed." "What are you—" "Trust me." Connor moved silently through the cannery's abandoned upper level. Most people didn't know about the old cargo zip line that once connected these buildings, used for moving supplies between warehouses. The cables were still there, hidden beneath. Years of neglect. A quick check of his tactical harness, and he was ready. The gang members on the rooftops were focused on the streets below, expecting trouble from ground level. None of them looked up. The first 2 never knew what hit them. Connor descended from above like a ghost, neutralizing them with precise strikes before they could radio for help. The third managed to get off a warning shout before a rubber round to the sternum silenced him. Below, the gang members spun their bikes around, trying to locate the threat. But Connor was already moving again, using the confusion to his advantage. A smoke grenade, non-toxic, designed for crowd control, turned the street into a swirling grey maze. "What the hell?" one of the bikers shouted. "Where is he?" Connor emerged from the smoke like an avenging spirit, his movements economical and devastating. 2 more gang members went down before they could draw weapons. A third swung a chain at his head, but Connor slipped inside the arc of the swing, redirecting the momentum to send the attacker crashing into his own colleague. But he'd forgotten about their backup. A new group of bikes roared around the corner, and this time they came prepared. The lead rider raised a sawed-off shotgun. "Get down!" Connor's shout carried through the smoke. But Sarah was already moving, hustling the last of her customers through the diner's back door. The shotgun blast caught Connor in the tactical vest as he dove for cover. The impact knocked the wind from him, but the armor held. He rolled behind. A parked car, calculating angles and options. Then he heard Sarah scream. 2 gang members had circled around through the alley, cutting off the diner's back exit. They had Sarah by the arms, dragging her toward their bikes. Something shifted in Connor's mind. The careful tactical calculations gave way to a cold, focused rage he hadn't felt since his last SWAT operation. He moved without hesitation. Each action precise and lethal in its efficiency. The first kidnapper never saw the strike that shattered his collarbone. The second managed to pull a knife, but Connor's counter was brutal and final. The man's wrist snapped with an audible crack. "James!" Sarah's warning came just in time. Connor spun, catching the chain meant for his head and yanking its wielder off balance. A precise strike to the solar plexus dropped the attacker, gasping, to the pavement. When it was over, 6 gang members lay groaning on the ground. The others had fled, their bravado shattered by the speed and precision of Connor's response. Sarah touched his arm as sirens wailed in the distance. "You're hurt," she said, noting how he favored his left side, where the shotgun blast had struck. "Just bruised," he assured her. But his eyes were scanning the street, marking shell casings and blood trails. "They'll be back with more men, better weapons." "Then maybe it's time you told me what really happened in Seattle," Sarah said quietly. "The mission that made you quit SWAT." Connor looked at her sharply. In the distance, more motorcycles revved their engines, a promise of violence to come. "Yes," he said finally. "Maybe it is." The fog rolled in thick that night, turning Port Harbor's docks into a maze of ghostly shapes and muffled sounds. Perfect conditions for what Connor had planned. He stood at his old spot on Pier 7, appearing to all the world like a foolishly stubborn old fisherman who hadn't learned his lesson. The bait was set. Rumors carefully spread through Sarah's diner about a midnight shipment coming in, something valuable enough to make the Black Tide gang forget their recent setbacks. Connor had spent decades learning how men like Razor thought. Greed and pride would override caution every time. "They're moving," Sarah's voice whispered through his earpiece. From her diner's upper floor, she had a clear view of the street. 15 bikes heading your way, Razor's leading them." Connor checked his watch. "Right on schedule." "Chief Barnes?" "In position," came the reply. "But James, are you sure about this?" "Trust me, Tom, just like Singapore." It was a reference to their joint operation years ago, one that had earned Connor his reputation for unconventional tactics. The motorcycles approached slowly, their engines barely above idle, an attempt at stealth that only made them more conspicuous in the fog-shrouded night. Connor counted the shadows as they spread out along the waterfront, noting their positions. Razor had learned from their previous encounters, keeping his men in tight groups of 3. "Where's this shipment, old man?" Razor's voice carried across the pier. "Or did you just get tired of living?" Connor turned slowly, his movements deliberately. "Stiff and aged. Don't know about any shipment, just fishing. Still playing that game?" Razor laughed, but there was an edge to it. "After what happened to your last set of gear, you must really love fish." "You could say that." Connor's hand moved slightly, triggering the first phase of his trap. A subtle vibration ran through the pier, not enough to notice unless you were looking for it. But beneath the wooden planks, carefully rigged pneumatic pistons were quietly sliding into place, ready to transform the familiar dock into something very different. "Search him," Razor commanded. 2 gang members moved forward, their boots heavy. On the wooden planks, Connor allowed himself to be roughly patted down, keeping his movements hesitant and fearful. "He's clean," one reported. "Just some fishing line and—" The trap sprung. Connor pulled the fishing line hard, triggering a cascade of events. The pistons fired, launching sections of the piers planking upward. Gang members stumbled as their footing suddenly betrayed them. In the same instant, powerful lights burst to life from beneath the pier, their glare amplified by the fog, creating a disorienting wall of white. Connor moved with practiced efficiency. The first two gang members went down before they realized what was happening. Their own confusion used against them. A third raised his weapon, but found himself fighting against a master of close-quarters combat. "It's a setup!" Razor shouted. "Surround him!" But the fog and lights had turned the pier into a tactical nightmare for the gang. Connor had spent weeks memorizing every board, every nail. He knew exactly where to step, while the gang members found themselves on treacherous ground. Police sirens wailed to life, their red and blue strobes adding to the sensory overload. Chief Barnes had his men positioned perfectly, cutting off the gang's escape routes one by one. The trap was complete. "Still playing games, old man?" Razor's voice was closer now, tinged with desperation. The knife was in his hand again. "Not a games," Connor replied, his voice carrying clearly through the chaos. "Tactics." The fight that followed was brief, but brutal. Razor had skill, but Connor had spent decades perfecting the art of close-quarters combat. Each move was calculated, each strike precise. When it ended, Razor lay groaning on the pier, his prized knife now in Connor's hands. 7 arrests, Barnes reported through the earpiece. "The rest scattered, but we got their bikes, and enough evidence of criminal activity to make the charges stick." Connor surveyed the aftermath. The pier had performed perfectly, its hidden modifications transforming it from a simple dock into a tactical advantage. Just like the man who had set the trap, there was more to it than met the eye. "James?" Sarah's voice came through the earpiece. Razor's second-in-command got away. He was talking on his phone, calling someone for help. Connor nodded, watching as police led the arrested gang members away. This victory would cost them nearly a third of their manpower, but he knew it wasn't over. Groups like the Black Tide always had contingency plans, outside connections. "Let them call," he said quietly, pocketing Razor's knife as evidence. "We'll be ready." The fog began to lift as dawn approached, revealing the full extent of Connor's trap. The pier stood unchanged, its hidden modifications once again concealed beneath an ordinary exterior. Just another reminder that in Port Harbor, the most dangerous predator was the one you never saw coming. Sarah's diner had become more than just a restaurant. After hours, with blinds drawn and doors locked, it transformed into a command center for Port Harbor's resistance. Connor stood before a group of determined locals, his tactical expertise now focused on turning ordinary citizens into a coordinated defense force. "The goal isn't to make you into fighters," he explained, demonstrating a simple wrist lock to Jenny Martinez and Mike Peterson, the harbormaster's son. "It's about awareness, communication, and knowing when to act and when not to." The diner's tables had been pushed aside, creating a makeshift training area. On the walls, Connor's tactical maps showed patrol routes, safe zones, and emergency rallying points. Sarah moved among the gathered townspeople, serving coffee and adding her own insights about the town's hidden shortcuts and safe houses. "They're bringing in reinforcements," Tom Barnes announced, entering through the back door. 3 trucks just rolled in from the highway, at least 20 new members, heavily armed. Connor nodded, having expected this. "They're trying to overwhelm us with numbers, but numbers mean nothing without coordination." He turned to the group. "Which is why we need to be smarter, more organized." He'd selected his core team carefully. Jenny Martinez's police training made her a natural deputy. Mike Peterson knew every boat and hiding spot along the waterfront. Sarah's diner gave her eyes and ears across the community. Each person had a role, a purpose in the larger strategy. "Remember," Connor demonstrated another defensive move, "they expect fear, submission. Every time you stand up, every time you resist, you disrupt their control." A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the blinds, they watched as 3 gang members approached Old Joe's hardware store. But this time was different. Other. Shop owners emerged from their businesses, standing silently in their doorways, watching. The gang members hesitated, suddenly unsure. "It's working," Sarah whispered, a smile in her voice. Connor moved to the back of the diner where his surveillance equipment monitored key points throughout town. The screens showed similar scenes playing out across Port Harbor. The gang's intimidation tactics were meeting quiet, organized resistance. "They're adaptable," he warned the group. "This will make them more dangerous. They'll try to reassert control through extreme violence. We need to be ready." As if to prove his point, a Molotov cocktail crashed through the hardware store's window, but the response was immediate. Fire extinguishers appeared from neighboring shops. Civilians moved with practiced coordination to control the blaze, while others photographed the attackers. It was exactly the kind of community response Connor had trained them for. "That's not random," Tom noted, studying the surveillance footage. "They're testing our response times, our organization." Connor agreed. The gang's tactics were becoming more sophisticated, suggesting outside help. He'd seen similar patterns before in his SWAT days. Someone with serious tactical experience was advising them. "Time for Phase 2, he announced, unrolling a new map. "They're not just fighting us anymore, they're fighting an entire town. And it's time they learned what that means." The meeting continued late into the night. Connor drilled his impromptu militia in communication protocols, emergency responses, and basic self-defense. But more importantly, he was teaching them something the gang hadn't counted on: how to work together, how to be a community again. As the last townsperson left through the back door, Sarah touched Connor's arm. "You're worried about something?" He nodded toward the surveillance screens. "Their new tactics, the reinforcements. There's a pattern here I recognize. Whoever's helping them knows what they're doing, and they know we're organized." "You think it's connected to Seattle?" she asked quietly. Connor's jaw tightened. "Maybe. Either way, this just became something bigger than a local gang trying to take over a small town." Outside, the night was quiet, too quiet. The calm before a storm that would test everything Connor had built, every person he had trained. But as he watched Sarah coordinate with their network of volunteers through encrypted channels he'd set up, he allowed himself a moment of pride. Port Harbor was no longer just his sanctuary. It had become his last mission, his chance to protect not just a town, but a community that had given him back his purpose. And this time, he wasn't fighting alone. The encrypted message arrived at midnight on Connor's secure terminal. "Remember Seattle. The ghost of Black Hawk Tower sends his regards." The words hit him like a physical blow, sending him stumbling back from the screen. Only 3 people knew what really happened that night in Seattle. One was dead, one was Connor himself, and the third, James. Sarah's voice crackled through his earpiece. "We've got movement at the north entrance. Multiple vehicles, not just bikes this time. Military." "Grade." Connor forced himself to focus, pulling up the surveillance feeds. 3 black SUVs rolled into town, their movements precise and coordinated. This wasn't just gang reinforcement, this was something else entirely. "Get everyone off the streets," he ordered, his mind racing. "Now!" The lead SUV stopped outside Sarah's diner. The man who stepped out moved with the unmistakable bearing of special operations training. Connor's blood ran cold as recognition hit him. Victor Kane, his former second-in-command from the Seattle SWAT team. "Hello, Port Harbor." Kane's voice boomed through a megaphone. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." "James Connor, I know you're watching. Time to finish what we started in Seattle." Connor's hands clenched into fists as the memories flooded back. The Black Hawk Tower hostage situation, Kane's betrayal, the dead hostages that Connor had been blamed for. It all made horrible sense now. Razor's military-style tactics, the gang's strategic precision, the familiar patterns he'd been noticing. "James?" Sarah's voice was tense. "What's happening?" "Get out of the diner," Connor ordered. "Now use the..." The explosion cut him off. The diner's front windows erupted in a shower of glass and flame. Through the surveillance cameras, Connor watched in horror as Kane's men methodically surrounded the building. "The old man's gotten soft," Kane announced, his voice carrying across the stunned silence. 5 years ago, he would have seen this coming, would have known that while he was watching us, we were watching him, learning his patterns, just like he taught us. Connor's tactical screen lit up with alerts. Similar teams were moving into position across town, targeting every safe house, every rally point he'd established. They hadn't just compromised his security, they'd been inside his operation from the beginning. "Chief Barnes," Connor barked, into his comm. "Status?" Static answered him. Then Kane's voice came through the channel. "Tom's taking a little nap, James, along with most of the police force. Don't worry, they're alive, for now. Unlike those hostages in Seattle." Connor's mind raced. Kane was using his own tactics against him, turning his carefully laid plans into traps. "But why here? Why now?" "Still haven't figured it out," Kane taunted. Razor was just the bait. He played his part perfectly, the aggressive gang leader pushing until you had to respond. Just like old times, right, partner? You always had to. Be the hero. Through the chaos of signals and alerts, Connor spotted movement in the diner's kitchen. Sarah was alive, using the escape route they'd planned. But she wasn't alone. Razor was there, his knife pressed against her throat. "You let her die, James," Kane continued, his voice dropping lower. "In Seattle. You chose the mission over my sister, left her to burn while you saved the others, and now history repeats itself." The truth hit Connor like a thunderbolt. Kane's sister, the rookie SWAT officer who'd been caught in the explosion. The one Connor couldn't reach in time. The failure that had haunted him for 5 years. This was never about the town, Connor breathed. This whole thing, the gang, the protection racket. "Just a way to draw you out," Kane confirmed. "To make you care again, to make you choose. Right now, my men are positioned at 12 critical locations across Port Harbor. In 10 minutes, those positions go up in flames, just like Seattle." Connor's screens showed him the truth of it. Explosives at the school, the medical center, the senior home. His own security network turned against him. "But you get to choose. Partner, Sarah's life, or the town's. The woman you've grown to care about, or the community you swore to protect. Tick-tock." Connor stared at his tactical display, watching as everything he'd built began to crumble. Kane had orchestrated the perfect revenge, forcing him to relive his worst failure to make the same impossible choice. But Kane had made one critical mistake. He thought Connor was the same man from Seattle, the one who would sacrifice everything for the mission, the one who would make the tactical choice over the human one. That man died 5 years ago. The question was, what would the new James Connor do? Connor's workshop became a war room in minutes. Mike Peterson arrived first, having escaped the marina through the underground tunnels. Jenny Martinez slipped in next, her uniform dusty from crawling through the old cannery ventilation system. Others followed, each member of Connor's core team, finding their way through the escape routes they'd drilled dozens of times. Kane's men missed the secondary comm channel, Connor explained, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "They studied my old tactics, but they don't know what I've learned since Seattle." "What about the chief?" Jenny asked, checking her backup. "Weapon, locked in the station's holding cells with the other officers. Kane's being theatrical, wanting me to know he could have killed them but chose not to." Mike spread out the underground utility maps they'd prepared. "We've got people hidden in 6 of the emergency bunkers, the ones Kane doesn't know about, but those explosives..." Connor nodded grimly. "He's using my own surveillance network to monitor the charges, but he made a mistake." He pulled up a complex diagram on his screen. "He thinks I'm still the same tactician from Seattle, the one who believed technology was the answer to everything." "What changed?" Jenny asked quietly. "I learned that the best security isn't in the systems." Connor turned to face his team. "It's in the people. Kane's watching our networks, our cameras, our usual routes. But he's forgotten what makes Port Harbor different from Seattle. Understanding dawned on Mike's face. The community, Connor allowed himself a small smile. Exactly. While Kane was studying my tactics, learning my security protocols, he missed the most important change. I'm not working alone anymore. He switched to a different display, showing a mesh of blue dots moving through the town. Every volunteer we trained is wearing a low-tech tracker. No signals Kane can detect, no network he can hack. Just simple direction-finding equipment from the fishing boats. But Sarah, Jenny started, is buying us time, Connor finished. She knows the plan. Even Razor doesn't realize she's leading him exactly where we need him to go. Connor's hands moved across his tactical board, placing markers with precise purpose. Kane expects me to either sacrifice Sarah to save the town or abandon everyone else to save her. He's prepared for both scenarios. What he's not prepared for is option 3, which is, Mike leaned forward, we save everyone. Connor's voice carried the quiet confidence that had made him a legendary SWAT commander. But we do it as a team. He outlined the plan quickly, efficiently. Each team member had their role, each civilian volunteer their part to play. It wasn't the elaborate technical operation Kane would be expecting. It was simpler, more direct, and infinitely more dangerous. Questions? Connor asked finally. Jenny checked her watch. 6 minutes until Kane's deadline. Think we can really pull this off? Connor thought of Sarah, walking into danger with absolute trust in him and their planning. Thought of every shop owner, fisherman, and resident who had stood up against the gang. This wasn't just about him and Kane anymore. It was about showing that a community united couldn't be broken by fear. We don't have a choice, he said simply. Positions everyone. And remember, no radio communication from this point. We do this old school. As his team moved out through pre-planned routes, Connor allowed himself one moment to confront the ghosts of Seattle. He'd carried the weight of that failure for 5 years. But maybe that wasn't the lesson he was supposed to learn. Maybe the real lesson wasn't about what he'd lost that night, but what he'd found here in Port Harbor. Not just peace, but purpose. Not just a hiding place, but a home worth fighting for. Time to end this, Victor, he whispered, checking his own equipment one last time. But this time, we play by my rules. The first phase of Connor's plan activated silently across Port Harbor. Old Joe from the hardware store killed the power to 3 city blocks, not through the main grid that Kane was watching, but by accidentally backing his truck into carefully selected utility poles. The resulting blackout seemed random, natural. In the darkness, Port Harbor's residents moved like shadows through their own streets. Mrs. Chen from the grocery store left her back door unlocked, creating a passage through the building. The Wilson kids on their bicycles acted as scouts, their casual rides relaying enemy positions through pre-arranged hand signals. Connor moved through the night like a ghost, his steps sure despite the darkness. Kane's men were professional, but they didn't know this town like its people did. They didn't know about the loose board in the baker's fence that led to a hidden pathway, or the old delivery tunnel under the post office. "Target 1 clear," came a whispered voice as Connor passed the school. Jenny Martinez and her team had already disabled the first set of explosives, not by trying to defuse them, but by flooding the basement where they were planted. Simple, effective, untraceable. Kane's voice boomed through the town's emergency speakers. 2 minutes, James, time to choose. But Connor was already counting down his own timeline. Through the mesh of alleyways and secret paths, his civilian volunteers were moving into position. Each one knew their role, each movement choreographed. To appear random while serving the larger plan, the medical center's explosives went next, not through any technical expertise, but because old Doc Wilson had simply moved his oxygen tanks next to them. Even Kane's professionals wouldn't risk detonating charges near compressed oxygen. 1 minute, Kane announced. "Do you feel it, James? The weight of all those lives, just like Seattle." Connor allowed himself a grim smile as he spotted Mike Peterson's signal from the marina, 3 quick flashes of a lighthouse beam. The senior home had been quietly evacuated through the underground parking structure. Its residents led to safety by teenagers who'd spent their lives exploring the town's hidden spaces. Kane's men were starting to realize something was wrong. Their radio chatter, picked up by Connor's remaining surveillance, showed growing confusion. The targets they were supposed to be watching were somehow slipping away, yet their monitoring systems showed nothing unusual. 30 seconds, partner. Still hiding in the shadows. Still letting others pay the price for your cowardice. But Connor wasn't hiding. He was exactly where he needed to be. 3 buildings away from Sarah's position, watching through an old fishing scope as she kept Razor talking, kept him distracted. The gang leader was so focused on his hostage that he hadn't noticed how she'd gradually maneuvered him away from support into an area the locals called Echo Alley for its distinctive acoustics. 10 seconds. Kane's voice held an edge of uncertainty. Now, something wasn't going according to his script. Connor reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metal whistle, the kind fishermen used to call their crews in fog. At exactly 3 seconds before Kane's deadline, he blew a single, sharp note. The sound bounced off the alley walls, amplified and distorted. To Razor, it seemed to come from everywhere at once. He spun, startled, his knife moving away from Sarah's throat for just a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. The self-defense moves Connor had taught her flowed perfectly. A twist, a strike, and Razor was stumbling backward, his prized knife clattering to the ground. Across town, similar scenes played out simultaneously. Kane's men found themselves confronted not by tactical teams or armed resistance, but by the coordinated actions of an entire community. Fire sprinklers activated in seemingly random patterns, disabling surveillance equipment. Delivery trucks accidentally blocked crucial intersections. Every route they'd planned for retreat or reinforcement was suddenly inexplicably obstructed. "Time's up, Victor," Connor spoke into the open air, knowing Kane's surveillance would pick it up. "But I'm not choosing between the town and Sarah. I'm choosing something you forgot existed, the strength of a community, standing together." The night erupted into coordinated chaos as Port Harbor showed exactly what that meant. The command SUV's door exploded open as Kane emerged, his face twisted with rage. "You think you've changed the game, James? You've just made it personal. Again." Through his scope, Connor watched his former partner survey the chaos erupting. Across Port Harbor, Kane's perfectly orchestrated plan was unraveling, but the look in his eyes suggested something more dangerous was coming. "Your sister made her choice that night, Victor," Connor spoke into the open channel, knowing Kane would hear. "She knew the risks when she went back for those files. She was following your orders," Kane's voice cracked with emotion. "Your precious mission to expose the corruption in the department. Your crusade. She believed in you." The memory hit Connor. Kate Kane, fresh from the academy, volunteering to help investigate dirty cops within their own SWAT team. Her determination to do what was right, no matter the cost. "James," Sarah's voice came through his earpiece, safe now at the rally point. "Chief Barnes is free. The station's back under our control." But Connor barely heard her. Kane was pulling something from his vehicle, a familiar black case that made Connor's blood run cold. "You remember this, partner? The insurance policy we were never supposed to use." Connor's mind raced back to their last mission together. The experimental breaching charges they'd been testing, the ones that had been banned for being too unstable, too destructive. Those charges were decommed for a reason, Victor. They're as likely to kill the user as the target. Like I care about that now. Kane laughed bitterly. "You took everything from me that night. My sister, my career, my reputation. Now I'm going to take everything from you, starting with that diner your girlfriend loves so much." Connor's tactical mind shifted into overdrive. The breaching charges would level half the block. No simple flooding or oxygen tanks would stop them, and Kane knew it. "Chief," Connor switched channels. "Get everyone back. Full evacuation, 4-block radius around the diner." "Already on it," Barnes replied. "But James, there's something else. We found files on Kane's laptop about Seattle, about what really happened that night." Connor's breath caught. "What kind of files?" "Evidence. Security footage, proving it wasn't your fault, proving Kate was working with the corrupt officers," Kane cut in, having hacked their channel. "That's what you're about to tell him, right? That my sister was dirty? That she deserved to die?" "She was trying to expose them," Connor said quietly. "She found out they were using SWAT tactics to help drug cartels. She was wearing a wire that—" "Night, Victor, recording everything." "Lies!" Kane roared. The black case clicked open. "The explosion wasn't an accident," Connor continued. "Those officers knew she was onto them. They set the charges, made it look like a breach gone wrong. I tried to reach her, tried to warn her." "Then why didn't you tell me?" Kane's voice was raw. "All these years, why?" "Because she made me promise." Connor closed his eyes. The weight of a 5-year silence finally lifting. Her last words. "She knew they'd come after you next if the truth got out. She died protecting you, Victor, and I honored her choice." The silence that followed was deafening. Through his scope, Connor watched Kane's hands tremble on the case. "Prove it," Kane whispered finally. "Check your laptop." Kate's final report. "Is there, encrypted, dated the night she died. She was a hero, Victor, and I've carried that truth every day since Seattle." Sarah's voice cut through the tension. "James, Razor's men are moving. They're not following Kane's orders anymore." Of course they weren't. They were thugs and opportunists, not loyal soldiers. With Kane distracted and their plan falling apart, they'd revert to what they knew: violence and chaos. The night wasn't over. Kane's revelation might have changed everything, but the town was still in danger, and Connor had made a promise to protect it. "Victor," he said softly, "help me finish what Kate started. Help me protect these people. It's what she would have wanted." The black case closed with a decisive click. The first Molotov cocktail arced through the night sky, its flame trailing like a comet before crashing into the harbor master's office. More followed, the gang's final assault launched with desperate fury. Without Kane's strategic control, they'd reverted to pure violence. "They're splitting into 3 groups, Connor observed from his position on the cannery roof, "trying to overwhelm us with chaos." "Just like you said they would," Kane's voice came through the comm channel. His tactical expertise, once used against the town, now provided crucial insight. "They'll target infrastructure first: power stations, fuel supplies, communications." Connor watched the gang members scatter through the streets, their previously disciplined formations deteriorating into aggressive packs. "Chief Barnes, status? Civilian evacuation at 80%. Safe houses are secure." A burst of gunfire punctuated Barnes's report, "But we're stretched thin." Through his scope, Connor tracked Razor as the gang leader emerged from hiding. The man's face was twisted with rage, his own authority stripped away by Kane's defection, his carefully maintained image of control shattered. "Sarah, are you in position?" Connor asked. "Ready," she replied from her observation post in the church tower. "I can see everything from up here. East Group is heading for the power station. West Group moving toward the marina. Center Group—" She paused. "They're gathering at the diner, Razor's with them." Of course he was. The diner had become a symbol. The heart of the resistance. Razor would want to burn it to the ground. "Time to show them what Port Harbor's really made of," Connor announced on the general channel. "Execute Pattern Delta." The town's response was beautiful in its coordination. As the East Group approached the power station, they found their path blocked by overturned fishing boats, hauled into position hours earlier. The West Group's attempt to reach the marina was met with a sudden deluge as the fire suppression systems activated, turned into improvised water cannons by Doc Wilson's modifications. But it was the center group, Razor's main force, that faced the true spirit of Port Harbor. As they charged toward the diner, every shop front along Harbor Street erupted with light and sound. Car alarms, air horns, flashlights, and emergency sirens created a wall of sensory chaos. The gang members stumbled, disoriented. "Now," Connor commanded. Port Harbor's volunteers emerged from doorways and alleys. Not to fight, Connor had been clear about that, but to stand together. Shop owners, fishermen, teachers, teenagers, hundreds of residents, armed with nothing but phones and cameras, documenting every crime, every face. "What are you waiting for?" Razor screamed at his men. "Burn it all." But his authority was crumbling. The gang members faced not tactical officers or armed resistance, but ordinary citizens refusing to back down. Every act of violence would be recorded, every face identified. There would be no anonymous escape. "James!" Sarah's urgent voice cut through the chaos. "Razor's breaking away. He's got something in his hand. It looks like Kane's breaching charges," Connor finished grimly. "He must have grabbed them during the confusion." He was already moving, years of SWAT training taking over as he plotted. An intercept course. "The diner?" Kane asked, knowing his former partner's mind. "No," Connor realized, watching Razor's path. "The fuel depot. He's going to try to take half the town with him." The night air filled with the roar of motorcycles. As gang members began to flee, their nerve breaking in the face of unified resistance. But Razor pressed on, the breaching charge clutched in his hands like a twisted trophy. Connor's voice carried across all channels. "Chief, get emergency services to the harbor. Sarah, coordinate with the volunteers. I want eyes on every escape." "Root, Kane." "Right behind you, partner," came the immediate response, "just like old times." "No," Connor corrected, his voice firm. "Better than old times, because now we're not just fighting for a mission, we're fighting for a home." The real battle for Port Harbor was about to begin. The fuel depot loomed ahead, its storage tanks silhouetted against the flame-lit sky. Connor moved through the shadows with practiced efficiency, Kane falling into step beside him as naturally as he had during their SWAT days. Years of anger and mistrust melted away in the face of a familiar threat. "He'll take the high ground," Kane whispered, gesturing toward the maintenance walkway that circled the main tank. "Best vantage point, maximum blast radius." Connor nodded. Some things never changed. The tactical assessment, the silent communication between operators. "Like Brisbane?" "Brisbane," Kane confirmed, referring to a hostage situation they'd resolved. Years ago, without another word, they split up, moving to flank the walkway from opposite sides. Sarah's voice crackled through their earpieces. "Visual confirmation on Razor. He's placing the charge on the western support strut. Timer's already running." Connor's breath caught. The western strut was the depot's weakest point. Its failure would cascade through the entire structure. Razor might be unraveling, but he still knew how to cause maximum damage. "How long?" Kane demanded. 4 minutes, Sarah reported. "But James, he's got a dead man's switch in his other hand," Connor cursed softly. Even if they reached Razor, they couldn't risk taking him down. One spasm of a dying hand, and the charge would detonate instantly. History repeats itself, doesn't it? Razor's voice echoed across the depot. The great James Connor, racing against time to save everyone. How'd that work out in Seattle? Connor pressed himself against a storage tank, analyzing angles and approaches. Razor's position gave him clear lines of sight in all directions. Any direct assault would be suicide. "You're bigger than this, Marcus," Connor called out, using Razor's real name. "This isn't about the gang anymore. This isn't even about control." "You're right," Razor laughed, the sound edged with madness. "This is about legacy, about making sure Port Harbor never forgets the day they stood up to the black tide." Kane's voice whispered through the comm. "Got a shot with the tranq gun, but if I miss—" "No choice," Connor replied. "On my mark." He stepped out into the open, hands raised. "Then let's talk about real legacies, Marcus, about what we leave behind. Kate Kane left behind the truth about corrupt cops. This town's leaving a legacy of courage. What's yours going to be?" Razor's finger tightened on the dead. "Then switch. My legacy? I'm the man who brought down the legendary James Connor. The one who made him choose again and watch everything burn just like Seattle." "Wrong," Connor said quietly. "You're the man who never understood what really happened that night. Why I made the choice I did. Why Kate made hers." "And what choice was that?" Razor sneered. "To trust in something bigger than ourselves." The words were a signal. At that exact moment, Sarah killed the depot's emergency lights, plunging the area into darkness. In the same instant, Kane's tranquilizer dart found its mark in Razor's shoulder, but Connor was already moving, his hand clamped around Razor's. Before the gang leader's muscles could spasm, maintaining pressure on the dead man's switch as the tranquilizer took effect. For a crucial moment, they were locked together, Connor's iron grip the only thing preventing catastrophe. "The timer," he gritted out. "Kane, on it." Kane was already working on the charge, his expertise with the device, making the disarming look easy. "Like you said, trust in something bigger." As Razor slumped unconscious, Connor carefully lowered him to the walkway, never loosening his grip on the switch. Below, he could hear sirens approaching, Chief Barnes coordinating the final cleanup of the gang's failed assault. "Charge disarmed," Kane announced. "It's over." Connor finally released the dead man's switch, his hand cramping from the sustained pressure. "No," he said, looking out over the town where fires were already being contained, where neighbors helped. Neighbors, where a community had stood together against terror. "It's just beginning." Sarah's voice came through their comms, thick with emotion. "James, the last of the gang's been rounded up. Port Harbor's safe." Safe. The word echoed in Connor's mind as he watched the sun begin to rise over the harbor. 5 years ago, he'd come here looking for safety, for escape. Instead, he'd found something far more valuable, a place worth fighting for, and people worth fighting beside. Dawn painted Port Harbor in shades of gold and orange as emergency crews worked to extinguish the last of the fires. Connor stood at his familiar spot on Pier 7, but this time he wasn't alone. Sarah was there, passing out coffee to tired volunteers. Kane sat nearby, helping Chief Barnes process the arrested gang members. The water lapped gently against the pilings, as if trying to wash away the night's violence. "FBI's on their way," Barnes announced, hanging up his phone. "They're particularly interested in the evidence about those corrupt SWAT officers from Seattle. Seems Kate's final report is opening a lot of old cases." Kane's hands stilled on his laptop. "She'd be proud of that. It's what she died for." "No," Connor corrected gently. "It's what she lived for, making a difference, protecting people, exposing the truth, just like this town lived for something bigger tonight." A commotion at the end of the pier drew their attention. Razor was being led to a transport vehicle, his previous swagger replaced by defeated silence. As he passed Connor, he paused. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "You had it all planned, every move, every counter. Why'd you wait so long to stop us?" Connor looked at Sarah, at the townspeople working together, at Kane sitting with decades of guilt finally lifting from his shoulders. "Because some victories aren't about stopping the enemy, they're about showing people what they're capable of." "Poetry," Razor spat, but his heart wasn't in it. As the deputies led him away, Connor could see the truth sinking in. The gang leader had wanted to be remembered as the man who broke Port Harbor. Instead, he'd become the catalyst that made it stronger. "We found your fishing gear," Sarah said softly, touching Connor's arm. "Some of the kids dove for it this morning, even fixed the rod. Turns out Mike Peterson's pretty good with repairs. Connor took the restored rod, Mary's father's rod, in his hands. The repairs were visible but solid, like the town itself, damaged but unbroken and stronger for having faced the storm. "You know," Kane said, closing his laptop, "Kate used to talk about what you'd do after SWAT. Said you'd find some quiet place and pretend to retire, but eventually you'd end up protecting people again. Because that's who you are." "She was wrong," Connor replied, testing the rod's action. "I didn't end up protecting people. I ended up teaching people to protect themselves." He cast the line out into the brightening waters. "That's the real victory." "Here," Sarah smiled, watching the townspeople continue their work. The diner's windows were already being replaced, neighbors pitching in without being asked. The harbor master was coordinating repairs to the fuel depot. Even Jenny Martinez was organizing a community watch program, incorporating the lessons learned during the crisis. "So what now?" she asked. "Back to being just a fisherman." Connor reeled in his lines slowly, methodically. "I'm thinking the town could use a proper security consultant, someone to train the police force, coordinate emergency responses." He glanced at Kane. "Maybe even work with federal agencies on cold cases." Kane nodded, understanding the olive branch being offered. "I hear the pay's lousy, but the coffee's good." "The best," Sarah agreed, "and the company's not bad either." A comfortable silence fell, broken only by the sounds of the town coming back to life around them. The morning catch was heading out, fishing boats carefully navigating around the cleanup. Crews! Life in Port Harbor was returning to normal, but it was a new normal. One built on strength proven, trust earned, and community forged in adversity. Connor cast his line out again, the familiar motion carrying none of the weight of the past. 5 years ago, he'd come here to escape his failures in Seattle. Now, those very failures had led to something unexpected. Redemption not just for him, but for Kane, for the town, for Kate's memory. The fish weren't biting, but that had never really been the point. A week after the black tide's fall, Port Harbor had already begun to heal. The physical scars were the easiest to address. Broken windows replaced, burned buildings repaired, bullet holes patched. But the deeper changes were more profound, visible in the way people carried themselves, in the new bonds formed between neighbors who had stood together. Connor watched from his usual spot as Sarah's diner reopened, its new windows gleaming in the morning sun. The line stretched down the block, not just regular customers, but people from neighboring towns who had heard the story of Port Harbor's resistance. They came for coffee and breakfast, but also for something more, a glimpse of what ordinary people could accomplish when they refused to bow to intimidation. "Your coffee's getting cold," Sarah said, appearing beside him with a fresh cup. "Though I suppose that's not unusual." He accepted the coffee with a smile that came easier now. The weight of Seattle, of Kate's death, of years of self-imposed isolation. It had all lifted, replaced by something lighter. Not peace exactly, but purpose. Inside the diner, Kane sat with Chief Barnes, poring over case files. The FBI had set up a temporary office in town, working through the evidence Kate had gathered. 3 former SWAT officers had already been arrested, their connections to drug cartels exposed. Kate's final mission was being completed, years after her death. "Jenny's doing well with the new training program," Sarah observed, watching the young officer lead a community defense class in the park, though she insists her instructor is a bit of a perfectionist. "Can't imagine who that might be," Connor replied dryly. The sound of hammering drew their attention to the harbor, where Mike Peterson was leading the reconstruction of the fuel depot. The new design incorporated suggestions from both Connor and Kane. Better security, clearer sight. Lines designated safe zones. Every repair was an opportunity for improvement. "You know," Sarah said carefully, "some people are worried you'll get bored now, that without a crisis to manage, you might move on." Connor cast his line into the calm harbor waters. The familiar motion was no longer an escape, but simply part of who he was, like the tactical skills he now shared openly, or the watchful eye he kept on his community. "Got too many commitments now," he said. "Training sessions to run. Security plans to review." He paused, glancing at her. "Coffee to drink." Sarah's smile widened. "And here I thought you just stayed for my coffee cake." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the sounds of the town going about its business. From his vantage point, Connor could see Port Harbor's transformation. The hardware store had become an unofficial community center. The marina now hosted regular safety drills. Even the old cannery was being renovated, a joint project between the police department and local volunteers to create a proper training facility. The black tide had come to Port Harbor looking for an easy target. Instead, they had found a community willing to stand together. Their attempt to break the town had only revealed its true strength. Mrs. Peterson walked past, her arm healed, carrying a basket of muffins to the construction crew. She waved to Connor, not as the former SWAT officer who had helped save the town, but as a neighbor, a friend, part of the fabric of Port Harbor itself. "You're smiling," Sarah noted. "That's still a bit unsettling." Connor reeled in his line, considering. "Just thinking about something Kate used to say, about how strength isn't about being bulletproof. It's about what you do when the bullets start flying." "Smart woman." "Yes," Connor agreed, watching his town go about its day, changed, but unbroken. She would have liked it here. 1 month after the Black Tide's defeat, Connor stood at the end of Pier 7 in the soft light of dawn. His fishing rod was propped against the railing, but for once he wasn't focused on the water. Instead, he watched Port Harbor wake up, seeing it with new eyes. The town moved with a different rhythm now. Shop owners unlocked their doors with confident purpose rather than fearful hesitation. The morning patrol, led by Jenny Martinez, recently promoted to sergeant, wasn't just a police round, but a community connection, with officers stopping to chat at each business. Kane's truck pulled up to the diner, boxes of case files visible. In the back, he'd officially joined the FBI's task force, turning his tactical expertise toward finishing what his sister had started. But he kept his office in Port Harbor, claiming the coffee was better than anything in Seattle. Everyone knew the real reason was deeper than that. "Caught anything?" Sarah's familiar question carried a new warmth as she approached with 2 cups of coffee. "Not fishing today," Connor replied, accepting his cup. "Just watching." "That's new." She leaned against the railing beside him, their shoulders touching comfortably, though I suppose a lot of things are new these days. She was right. The town had changed, and so had he. The solitary fisherman seeking escape had become something else, a teacher, a protector, a part of something larger than himself. The nightmares of Seattle had faded, replaced by the simple pride of watching his students master a defensive technique or seeing neighbors help neighbors. "Think we'll ever go back to being just a quiet fishing town?" Sarah asked. Connor smiled, picking up his rod. "We're still a quiet fishing town. We just learned to be something else too." As if to prove his point, a fish chose that moment to bite. Connor reeled it in with practiced ease, the morning sun glinting off the water. Just another day in Port Harbor, where a former SWAT officer had found not just peace, but purpose. Where a town had discovered its strength. Where the tide had turned and kept turning, carrying them all toward whatever adventure came next. The fish wasn't very big, but he kept it anyway. After all, Sarah made the best fish and chips in town, and these days Connor had learned to appreciate the simple pleasures of sharing a meal with family.